Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Henry, and this presentation is a startup guide for classroom teachers of multilingual learners. And it's designed to show teachers how to collect the information that you need to know about MLLs and prepare to teach them this year. So if you have multilingual language learners in your class this year and you're maybe a little concerned or you have questions about what that's going to look like and what you're going to do, this presentation is for you. So before we begin, if you haven't already done so, you should probably print the presentation handbook that I've created to go along with this presentation. It is linked in the description of this video. So print or save it to your computer if you prefer. There's going to be some opportunities throughout this presentation to stop and prepare for the year ahead. And I'll refer to that handbook when that time comes. It also has some links and some QR codes that you might find useful going forward. All right, so let's get started. The objectives for this presentation are, 1, to identify your MLLs, or multilingual language learners, and their needs. Then to consider differentiation based on that student's proficiency, and what differentiation looks like in your classroom. The third one is to understand assessment and reporting processes for MLLs in New Brunswick. And fourth is to know where to find resources and support as the year progresses, and to know where to find those things that are available to you if you are teaching multilingual language learners. All right, so the first part of this presentation, we're going to learn about MLLs and language proficiency. So in New Brunswick, we use the CEFR, or the Common European Framework of Reference, when we talk about language proficiency. And newcomers are assessed when they're registered in New Brunswick schools, or at least in Anglophone School District West. We assess all of our newcomer students, or we register them for your school. And so that assessment information is available to you, and it will help you know what to expect from a learner. I'm going to show you where to access that information. First, we're going to look at the CEFR proficiency levels that you might see for your learners. So in New Brunswick, we support A1 learners, A2 learners, and B1 learners of English. So students who are coming in and who are assessed at those levels are given some extra support in the West in our schools through things like tutoring and courses to support EAL, things like that. So as I'm explaining the levels of proficiency, I want you to think about what points will be most impactful in your classroom, in your specific situation, based on your level that you teach, based on the subject that you teach, what things that I just say as I'm describing these levels are going to have the biggest impact in your world. Also note that these descriptions are independent language use. So these are the things that a student can do if it's an A1 language learner, things that they can do independently. Now, you're going to want to do things that are beyond the scope of these descriptions, and using language at a higher level is possible, but will require scaffolds, and those scaffolds, things that we'll talk about later in the presentation. So an A1 is a beginner. Students who come in from another country where they may have learned a little bit of English at school, maybe once a week for a couple of years. They might be an A1 beginner learner. These are students who can understand and use familiar everyday expressions and very basic phrases to meet their immediate needs. So this includes things like introducing themselves, asking and answering questions about personal details. So giving their name, where they're from, how old they are, what they like and what they don't like. But they're going to be very limited to things that are familiar to them. An A2 is a high beginner. So an A2 is someone who has probably been studying English or immersed in English for a little while. They're someone who can communicate in simple and routine tasks that require simple and direct exchange of information on familiar topics and activities. They can describe things in simple terms. They can, for example, talk about their own background, their immediate environment, and their basic needs. It's still important at the A2 level that topics are familiar. They are probably going to struggle if you asked them to talk about something that they're not familiar with. But within those basic, that basic sphere of things that they do, things that they like, things that they have experience in, they'll probably be able to speak and understand language at a fairly acceptable level. A B1 student would be considered an intermediate language user. Those students are able to deal with most situations that they would encounter in daily life. When they would experience challenges would be within that academic context. So learning about a specific topic in science and social studies, when we get words that are specific to that context, is really what's going to challenge a B1 learner. But they can produce simple texts on topics that are familiar or of personal interest to them. They can describe experiences. They can talk about their ambitions. They can explain. They can give their opinion on things. And so their language is really developing to a more advanced level as a B1 learner, but they will still struggle in certain tasks in certain areas. So you'll find further information about the CEFR levels in your handbook. So if you've had it saved or printed, have a look. You're going to look at page 1 of the handbook. And pause the video to read it over. And then on page 2 of the handbook, I want you to think about, as I already said earlier, the details that you think will be most relevant to your own classroom situation and your own teaching. So think about how you might to adjust your teaching to meet the needs of a multilingual learner in your class at the A1 level, at the H2 level, and at the B1 level. What are those things that you need to keep in mind as you are teaching those students? So pause the video and complete that first task that's on page 2 of your handbook. So now I'm going to show you where to find information about your students. So the first thing that you want to do is kind of come up with a list of who is a newcomer. So to find out who is a newcomer from your class lists, are going to look for the globe icon. So the globe icon is what you can see circled on the screen right now. And you would see that in your PowerSchool class lists. You can click on that globe icon to quickly find out some information about a new student, the students who are in your class. So by clicking on the globe icon, you can usually find out the country of origin for your student, the date that they've started school in New Brunswick, the language level that they were either assigned in their registration session, or if they've been here for a while, as they have maybe been assessed throughout their time here in our New Brunswick schools. Their primary language, which can be helpful when you're dealing with either with parents or looking at differentiating for students' needs. Time, which basically is the same as the start date, but how long they've been here, if it's over 3 years or under 3 years, which can be important when we're talking about support. And also language development, if support is required or support is not required for that student. And all of these bits of information would apply more or less in different situations. So from here, if you want to turn to page 4 of your handbook, you a list of students who have globes next to their names and start to record some of that information. Another place that you can go to find information about students is the SharePoint site. So on this ASD-West International SharePoint registration site, this is where we load information about students who register, as well as a district team where we store information about those students. So as a teacher at a school in ASD-West, you can access the registration files for students at your school. And the best way to do that is using the search bar that's in the SharePoint. And there is a link to the SharePoint site at the back of the handbook, so you can access that easily. So using the search bar, typing in the last name of the student should bring up a list of documents that would be related to that student. And registration files are one thing you will find there. So if you have a newly registered student, it might be something you want to look at. You'll also find things like WIDA assessments. WIDA assessments are done by district staff at different points throughout a student's educational career, or if there's concerns about a student's progress, and they would be stored in there. You also might find progress charts stored in there. So progress charts are compiled by our EAL tutors who support students through tutoring at their schools, and they are reviewed by EAL leads and put into the SharePoint, so you can see there the students' progress over time based on their language development. So the other thing that you might find there that you might find useful would be the social history. So especially for a brand new student who's just registered, say, over the summer, the social history is where you're going to find the most valuable information about that student. And so the social history is really the information that's compiled via interview with the student and their parents. So it will tell you, for example, if they have interrupted schooling, if they speak English, read or write English, home language, or their other languages. It might tell you if they have special interests, if they have concerns, medical concerns, things like that. And if they are connected to a multicultural center, that information would also be in there. So it's a really valuable document for you to look at if you have a brand new student. Now, over time, obviously, that information becomes outdated, but for a brand new registered student, it's definitely something that you're going to want to look at. So the next thing that we want to do, think about the students and the students and collect some information about them using these two places for information. So first thing that you're going to do, to prepare for the school year, I guess, is to looking at page 4 of the handbook, make a list of your newcomers that are in your class or your classes this year. And you'll do that just by clicking on the globe icons. Take note of the students, their CEFR level, how long they've been in Canada, their home language, nationality, that kind of information just from the globe. And it's a really simple thing for you. If there's students that have an A1 or A2 language level, then you might want to consider completing a student profile for them, which is found on page 5 and 6 of your handbook. It's just a little bit of additional information that you may want to look up for those students because of their additional language needs. So pause the video, and then when you're ready to continue, when you come back, we're going to be talking about linguistic inclusion, specifically for A1s, but also some general information, as well as assessment and reporting practices. So pause the video now and complete those tasks to find out who your students are this school year. All right. So now that you know who is in your class, you may be wondering how to ensure that you and they have a great year and exactly what is expected of everyone in this equation that you have, going on in your classroom. And I think that some teachers really overcomplicate it. It doesn't need to be complicated. So go easy on yourself. You have a lot of language learners in your classrooms. As long as you're making an effort and doing your best, then I'm sure that you are doing enough. There's really 3 things that are required to teach multilingual learners effectively. And if you're doing these 3 things, then they will learn. So it will take some time, especially for those A1s, the kids who are coming in with little to no English, but they will get there. So ensuring that you have these things built into your instruction is really what you need to be doing if you have language learners in your classroom. So those 3 things are background knowledge, vocabulary, and interaction. So as I talk about each of these, you can follow along in your handbook. I'm on page 8, and you're going to find details about each of these on page 8 of your handbook. All right, so first is background knowledge, and we build background knowledge as teachers all the time, but we need to ensure that it's a little bit more elaborate when we're talking about newcomer students. Newcomer students are coming with different background knowledge than our New Brunswick born and raised students. They have different experiences, they have different cultural norms, and all of that just requires a little bit more background building from the teacher. So in order to do that, You can provide a topic summary or an article or a video in the student's first language beforehand. Maybe if it's the day before you're teaching a topic, provide them with some sort of a video or an article to look at so that they can learn about the topic in their own language before you cover it in class. You could preview photos and visuals from the lesson. Get students to label the image before you teach the topic. This will ensure that they have some exposure to the language before you teach them this new information. You can also make sure that things like anchor charts are co-created with students and exposed around the classroom so that students can reference them throughout learning. So background knowledge and taking the time to build that with students is essential for your newcomer learners. So the second thing that you want to make sure you're focusing on if you have newcomer students is vocabulary. Of course, learning a new language is really learning vocabulary first, and then using that vocabulary in structures and sentences is kind of how our language develops. But if you're teaching them a specific academic subject, you're going to want them to learn specific vocabulary. So emphasizing the vocabulary that you want them to learn in a lesson is really important. So having a word or words of the day maybe, and making sure that newcomer students and all students really know the words and are familiar with them, reviewing those words, etc. We would encourage you to create thematic word walls for students to reference, and really limiting new vocabulary to a couple of words per lesson. But adding those interactively with students to a word wall will keep them available for students to reference as they are learning and acquiring that new vocabulary. Labeling images, as we talked about with background knowledge, it's also really effective for building vocabulary. And so it's a great way to teach vocabulary, review vocabulary, review a topic in general, just by having students label an image with the terms and academic vocabulary that you've taught them. And then the final pillar of instruction for language learners is oral interaction. And so using the language orally is really the thing that's going to make it stick with your newcomer students. Just being exposed to new language and new vocabulary isn't enough for retention. They have to use that, and they have to use it in an authentic way. And so interactive activities are really important. And keeping things structured as much as possible will support your language learners as well. So things like oral use of vocabulary and content by students, making the students do the work, things that we talk about in education and have always done. You want to aim for 80% student talk time if possible. And that can be a lot, but aiming just to increase that every day is a benefit to students. And structuring interactions is also going to help keep students on task. So strategies like QSSA is recommended for language learners, and those are some things that I'll show you where to find out more about those towards the end of the presentation. Encourage collaboration and group work whenever possible. For your new students, it could be as simple as having them repeat things, having them repeat sentences, having them repeat vocabulary out loud so that they are hearing themselves use it and they get used to actually forming those words and sounds in English. Take advantage of a student's home language, though, when possible, because that can help them to increase their understanding and engagement in the lesson. So whether it's by talking to another student who may speak their language, or by using translations, by using first language resources, all of those things are going to help with student learning. So these three tenets of effective instruction, if you are making an effort to incorporate them into your daily lessons, then you will most likely be meeting the needs of most of your multilingual learners in your classroom. Now, A1s are challenging, okay? Those things that we just talked about are essential for A1s as well, but often teachers feel like they're not doing enough for their A1s. And I get that. I've been there. You have to give them the language for the task. And I find that a lot of times teachers forget that. They'll do a lot of really, really great scaffolding and try to include their A1 learners in the classroom activities, but they don't give them enough of the language for the task. And if you don't know the language, you can't produce anything without that input. So how do you give them the language required for the task? Well, you can use visuals and gestures and simple language. You can encourage repetition of new words and phrases. Display words throughout your classroom, labels, thematic word walls, anything like that. Provide sentence starters and frames for oral and written output. This one is really helpful. Anytime that you're asking them to say or write something, give them a sentence starter. So tell them how to start it off, and then they can finish it if they have some of that vocabulary. Modeling, examples, and samples are really, really valuable for an A1 learner. You can show them how it needs to look or how it needs to sound and give them a little bit more confidence when they do it. Translanguaging, as we just said, leverage their first language so that they can understand a concept and then learn it in English. Also, things like alternate means of demonstrating learning. UDL is so important for our newcomer students and for all students, of course, but they don't need to do the same thing as every other student in the classroom. Oftentimes, they can show you their learning in other ways when that assessment or assignment that the rest of the class is doing is just out of their reach. And sometimes you might want to set language goals in addition to or in place of content goals for A1s. On page 9 of your handbook, you're going to find the next activity that I'd like you to do. So it asks that you think about the way your class tends to run. So what are the methods or strategies or activities that you tend to use a lot in your classroom? And think about the MLLs that you have in those classes and what their abilities are, what their proficiency levels are. And think about how you will differentiate for those activities and your learners. So there's space on page 9 for 4 activities, 4 strategies or things that you do a lot. So for example, maybe you tend to give a lot of articles with questions. Okay, so you read a page maybe from Newsella, and then you answer some questions about it. Okay, so the questions would go in one of those boxes, and now how are you going to adjust it for your A1s or A2s or B1s, depending on who is in your class. You have A1s, well, maybe you're going to find them a similar text in their first language. You can use Google Translate to do that, or some websites will give you options for accessing texts in other languages. For your A2s, maybe you're just going to give them a simplified version of that English text. But think about how you can adjust those activities that you tend to use over and over again. So pause the video, and once you've completed that activity, we will move on to the next topic. All right, so at this point, you haven't thought already, you may be thinking, the kid's doing something completely different. They're not participating in classroom in the same activities as the rest of the students, or they're not capable of expressing the language that the rest of the students are. How do I assess them? So the Department of Education has guidelines in place for equitable assessment and reporting when it comes to newcomer students. So how it works is that if you have a newcomer student in your classroom who is at a beginner level of English learning, then you need to most likely differentiate for those students within the classroom. You're going to use scaffolds. You're going to build background knowledge and vocabulary and interaction into your day. And whenever possible, you're going to assess an MLL using language accommodations and UDLs based on the course outcomes. You can scaffold instruction and assessment. And hopefully, for some students, in some cases, you're going to be able to assess them on the same outcomes as the rest of the students in the classroom. But with A1s and sometimes further on, you might not be able to collect information to assess certain content objectives. And when that happens, you just can't give them a grade on a certain topic. You do not need to assign them a failing grade. There's further instructions for this available, and we can share those with you. However, just to summarize, for K-8, the process when it comes to report cards is selecting the EAL checkbox and then selecting NA in place of the 1 to 4 mark. When you do that, you're indicating that you have not been able to assess them because you can't communicate with them. You would then write comments about the learner's strengths and needs and/or next steps for that learner. Now for 9 to 12, the report cards are different, of course. So for 9 to 12, you do not provide a numerical mark at all if you are unable to assess enough of the outcomes to do so. So you may have assessed some outcomes. If you feel comfortable giving them a grade based on the assessments that you have been able to complete, then do so. We would always want to see where it has been earned. But if you're not able to assess them sufficiently, then you don't put a mark, and you're going to instead insert the comment code that are either A1.1 or A1.2, depending on the level of that student. And you should also be providing an anecdotal report that details their goals and their progress in your class. This is because students have a right to receive frequent information about their progress. And by not giving them a grade, we need to give them some information about their progress and how we see that they are doing. So reporting processes are in place for your MLLs. And hopefully that kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off when it comes to teaching and assessing them in your classroom. All right, so With that in mind, okay, the fact that you don't need to necessarily assess all of your language learners, especially those beginner ones, what are you going to do with your A1s? We come back to the A1s a lot because as teachers, we want to see our students grow and succeed. And something I often hear from teachers when I'm working with them is that they just feel like they are failing these students. With A1s, you just really want to aim for engagement. And engagement can look different for language learners, especially A1 learners, because they can be engaging with the language rather than the content or the specific learning that the rest of the students might be doing. So language learning in this case can be secondary to the content. Intentional planning is really important, and thinking about comprehensible input and output for your students is important. You can't just say like, oh, they'll be fine, they'll participate when they can. If they can't, they will watch. You're not really going to find that a student will be successful in that kind of situation. But with putting a little bit of thought into how their language can develop in a lesson, even if they're not focused on the learning that the rest of the class might be focused on, you will find that students will grow and learn in those cases. So things like vocabulary, what's the vocabulary that you want them to learn? When and where will they interact in a lesson, and how can you support that? Thinking about some visuals that you can incorporate in the lesson and how will a student engage with those visuals. And translanguaging, again, is one of the top ways that you can engage students with content and just with the learning that they need to do in order to improve. So aiming for engagement every day, thinking about how will this student engage with something, with learning, with others, and what will that look like? That was a very brief kind of overview of teaching A1s and having them in your classroom. And if you want to learn more than that, if you want specific scaffolds and strategies and tips and tricks for teaching A1s and MLL language learners in general, we have other videos that I would encourage you to have a look at. These are all created by EAL leads. Designing task-based learning, using the CEFR is one of them. Keeping expectations high for MLLs is another. Simple scaffolds for MLLs in content classrooms is another one. These are all great explanations that I would encourage you to look at. If you're not that kind of a learner, reach out to us directly, and EAL leads are always happy to come in and support you in your classroom with your learning and with your students. So as we kind of approach the end of this video, I want to refer you to the last couple pages of your handbook, where you're going to find links and references to some of the different things that are available to support you as you teach newcomer students and multilingual language learners this year. So the first thing that I want to share with you is, of course, that we have a team of EAL specialists in ASD-West who are available to help you. Just reach out to any of us, and let us know what you need, and we can direct you to the right person who might be assigned to that need or your school, or whatever it might be. So Heath Curry is our new subject coordinator for EAL this year. You can reach out to him. And our current leads going this 2024-2025 school year are Denise Bullock, myself, Stephanie Henry, Christy Jordan, and Sarah Marr. So you can find us all via email and reach out with any questions or concerns that you might have. We are here to support you. The thing that teachers can and should use to support them in their work here is MCIS interpretation services. So this is a translation service that anyone in our schools can access. You sign up, you indicate the language that a student or family speaks, and an interpreter will sign on and interpret any of the conversations that you need to have with a language learner who doesn't speak English well enough for you to communicate effectively. These are great. This is a great service for you to use, for example, during parent-teacher interviews, or if you have an ESS meeting with a family that you just really want to ensure comprehension on a topic. So there's a link to more information for that service available to you at the back of your handbook. Another link you'll find there to the Multilingual Language Learner Curriculum Companion Document. So this is new last year, and it's a companion document that is a companion document to any course, any subject, any level when multilingual language learners are part of the course. And there's tons of really great information there that can support you with your classroom this year. The next category is more support for students. So you have students in your classroom and what's available to them. So within your school, you can, like I said, reach out to, of course, the district team, but you can also reach out to your EST-EAL if you have one at your school. Not all schools do, but many do now. And they can support you with students. Your school may also have an EAL mentor who may be able to give you some advice or details about a learner. If your school has an EAL teacher, then they may also be able to support students and you in the process. School ESS teams are also able to support newcomer students in all of the services that are available to a Canadian-born student are available to newcomer students as well, for the most part. For students, we have some learning materials that have been created, by the district, by us, that are available to you. So you can find links to those at the back of your handbook. One is to a Padlet that we've created for A1 learners. That is a collection of printable resources and learning activities that you can use with A1 students. And One Book, Many Ways is another one that is available on the YouTube page, I believe, for today's PL as well. And it is a collection of activities that accompanies a book that is called This Is How We Do It, which is a wonderful book that can be used throughout all of your curriculums. And there's a resource that we've created to go along with that book. Some other things that are really valuable when you're working with language learners are Unite for Literacy, which is a website that provides multilingual e-reading. So you can read a book, a beginner reader, and then a student can listen to that book in English as well as their home language. So that's really great. Google Translate and Canva for Education are both really, really powerful tools that are constantly getting better, that you can use to create resources, to translate resources that you already have. So if you haven't looked at those recently, definitely have a look and see what they can do, because they can do amazing things. Further learning, we're all learning all the time. You've been to our YouTube channel now, and you can find a lot of different topics and video recordings there, and we add to it whenever we can. There's also MLL Minutes, which is our EAL newsletter that you should watch for. They're sent out to schools each month, and they also will be sent by email this year. So you can watch for those different topics each month. There are EAL teaching PL modules that the Province of New Brunswick Department of Education has created, which are incredibly useful if you want to, learn more about teaching EAL and teaching language learners. And you can also find links to UMB Lyric videos. Lyric is the second language center at UMB Department of Education. And so they have some pedagogical videos as well that are linked on the EECD EAL K-12 SharePoint site. So lots of things there that if you want to further your learning, you can do so. And I've said it before, but if there's any questions you have, even if it's, where can I learn about this topic, just reach out to an EAL lead, and we're happy to direct you to something that would be useful. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. I want to thank you for supporting newcomers in ASD-West schools this year and taking time today to watch this video and work through the process of getting to know who the students are in your classes and think about how you might differentiate your teaching for those students this year. My contact information is there. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to help you out. All right, have a fantastic year.